Today we're going to look at the MU2 streaming DAC from the Netherlands Grimm Audio. However, calling the MU2 a streaming DAC just doesn't really do it justice because it is far more than that. In this video, I'll go over all that the Grimm box has to offer, and I will tell you about a blind comparison, a side-by-side comparison that I did with the Mola Tambaqui. And I'll also have some things to say about DACs in general. And as usual, we'll be using music that you would read about on Pitchfork, Resident Advisor, and Rolling Stone.
This episode is brought to you by the MP200 G3 multi-source player from Germany's T+A. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
I first started reviewing standalone DACs way back in 2010, but in 2023 I stopped. I made a video about 6 of my favourites and then I drew a line under them all. And at 11,000 euros, the Mola Tambaqui was as far as I wanted to go. But my pal Michael Lavorgna, who runs Twittering Machines, pulled me back in again. Because in early 2024, he told me he thought Grimm's MU2 might be even better than the Tambaqui. And at that point, I knew I had to try one. Besides, I've really continued to review streaming DACs, and the Grimm fits right into that category. Now, to get digital signal into the MU2, we use the inputs on the back panel, so we get coax, Toslink, AES EBU and Ethernet, but there's no Wi-Fi here. And like the Mola Tambaqui, the Grimm MU2 streams only from Roon. Now, Grimm's digital filter was designed in-house, and they call it the pure Nyquist filter, and it oversamples all incoming digital signals to 8 times their base rate instead of the MU1's 4 times. And I know this because designer Elko Grimm told me. He also told me that the MU2's filter uses a crazy number of bits, I think those were his words, instead of the MU1's 24 bits. And I'll link to Grimm's white paper on the pure Nyquist filter in the show notes below. And according to Elko Grimm, there is also a correspondingly strong emphasis on the quality of the internal clocking as that oversampled signal is fed into the DAC. Now, the DAC in the MU2 doesn't come from an off-the-shelf chip from the likes of ESS, Cirrus Logic, or AKM. It's an instruction set that's been coded to an FPGA. So that puts the MU2 DAC next to Ted Smith's work at PS Audio, or Rob Watts's at Chord Electronics, or Bruno Putz's at Mola. Now, Grimm calls its DAC the major DAC, and I'll link to the white paper on that also in the show notes below. But as with most DAC units, there are still many unknowns. For example, we know very little about the MU2's power supply or its analog output stage. Well, I know very little about it, but if you know more, let us know in the comments below. Now, the analog outputs on the back of the Grimm MU2 come in 2 flavors. We get single-ended RCA and balanced XLR, and I've had the Grimm connected to a multitude of downstream gear. And last autumn, I had the XLR outputs drive a power amplifier and the RCAs a powered subwoofer. And I checked in with Elko Grimm to make sure this wouldn't overly stress the output stage, and he said that would be unlikely. Now, if you want to hear more of what Grimm, the man himself, has to say about the MU2, you can listen to my podcast conversation with him. Again, the link to that below. Most recently, I've had the MU2 front a Vivid Audio loudspeaker system with amplifiers from Technics, from Mola, and from Luxman. And the Kaya 45, you can see the green Barber Papa speakers behind me, are quite possibly the most revealing speakers I've ever had in this room. And the MU2's audible prowess is much more easily heard through those speakers and say the Luxman L-505z than it is through the Wharfedale Super Linton driven by the Quad 33 and 303. And that brings us directly to some side-by-side comparisons. So if you're new here, side-by-side means I had both products here at the same time and that I'm not leaning on long-term memory, because long-term audio memory is entirely fallible. And that's important when we already know that the audible differences between DACs are small, smaller than the audible differences between amplifiers, loudspeakers, and especially rooms. And so a bit of advice, if I may here, if you've got MU2 money burning a hole in your pocket, don't spend the 18 grand on the Grimm until you've acoustically treated your room, because 18 grand will buy you a whole lot of room treatment, some of it invisible. Done that? Okay, cool, let's move on. Let us be very clear that the Grimm MU2 runs rings around the WiiM Ultra and the FiO-R9. It extracts more detail than its Chinese rivals, and its microdynamic flicker is much more overt. And I would say that the MU2 organises soundstage players with much cleaner focus. Not only that, tonal colours are richer. So think about the difference between an oil painting and a watercolour and you'll understand really where I'm coming from here. But if that sounds too pretentious, know that the Grimm, like the Mola Tambaqui, makes music sound more believable. But again, these differences are subtle compared to the differences between speakers and rooms. And this is actually the main reason why I stopped reviewing standalone DACs in 2023. Now, some of you will be asking, could I pick the differences between two DACs in a blind listening test? And I would say, yeah, definitely. And I know this because the final 2 days spent pitting the Grimm against the Mola were done blind. And that blind test confirmed what I had previously concluded from 2 months of sighted side-by-side comparisons. Now, the sighted listening was done with an AudioQuest Thunderbird balanced XLR cable. However, for the weekend-long blind listening test, I used AudioQuest's Golden Gate interconnects. I've got them here. I'll hold them up to show you on the camera, because this is basically the only cable that I have two of. But you can see, and you can probably guess, that these Golden Gate being RCAs force me to use RCA to XLR adapters on the back of the Tambaqui. And these adapters were supplied to me by Mola. And in preparation for this blind listening test, I set up the Grimm and the Mola DACs as a grouped Roon zone, and then I level matched their outputs, and then I disconnected each one from the back of the amplifier, because then I played vinyl for a couple of hours, and then I had a friend reconnect the two DACs to the back of the Luxman amp on the first day and to the Technics on the second. And yes, I stepped out of the room on both occasions. Now, once sat in the listening position, I could flip between the two line level inputs with each amplifier's remote control. And we only looked up which input belonged to which DAC at the end of each day. So, listening to Dark Side's Hell Suite Part 2, the Grimm shows us a slightly clearer and more expressive top end than the Mola. But the MU2 isn't quite as mid-bass rich as its smaller and more affordable rival. Now, let us not forget that the MU2 sells for a whopping 18 grand and the Tambaqui for an equally, well, not quite as whopping, 11 grand. Now, one of my favourite low-end test tracks is Brendan Muller's Rooted, and it shows us that the MU2 kicks a smidge harder with sub-bass dynamics than the Tambaqui. Now note, I'm not saying sub-bass reach, but I'm saying sub-bass dynamics. And Massive Attack Splitting the Atom confirmed pretty much the same, with the MU2 exposing a little more bass texture. However, clicking over to Craig Finn's Bethany, one DAC made me sit up in my chair. because I wanted to know, was it really drawing Finn's voice with a crisper outline than the other one? Yes, it was. And that DAC turned out to be the MU2. So I would say the Mola sounds ever so slightly more diffuse in the mid-range than the Grimm. And flipping that around, that means the Grimm nudges the lens into ever so slightly sharper focus. And the MU2 also lent a little more ease to the sometimes brittle sounding cataract time by Destroyer. Now, please note that both of these DACs are easeful sounding DACs. And I will underscore it again. We are working at the very skinny end of the hi-fi system wedge here. And I'll say this too, if you only want to use the MU2 as a standalone DAC and Roon endpoint, I don't think the juice is worth the extra financial squeeze over the Tambaqui. However, the MU2 is far more than a standalone DAC. It has a headphone output on the back panel, just like the Tambaqui. And maybe I heard greater avidity on, what's that track called? Is it called The Return of the Giant Hogweed? That's from Genesis' album Nursery Crime. And I definitely heard that greater avidity on Bowie's Sue, where I think the soundstage widened ever so slightly on the Grimm. However, that was comparing the sound of each unit's 1/4-inch socket with a pair of Meze Elite. And the Tambaqui's balanced output and its extra oomph leveled the playing field because the Grimm has no balanced headphone output. And in headphone mode, we lean on each DAC's internal volume control. Now the MU2's is all analog and built around a relay-triggered resistor ladder circuit. And control of that comes from the jog wheel on top, the Roon app, or the web interface. Now that web interface means we can access playback control and change the MU2's advanced settings with any device, not just a smartphone or a tablet. And the jog wheel on top is incredibly satisfying to use, much more so than the Mola's click buttons. Those click buttons are fine, but that jog wheel, oh, it's nice. And the MU2's wheel can be short pressed for play pause in Roon, and if you do it on other inputs, I think it activates the mute. But if we want a red hot chili peppers button, we have to use the Grimm's infrared remote learning capabilities, because there's an IR receiver in the box, but I didn't end up using that because the wheel is just so nice. And its turn and click actions can also be used to change the inputs and access some of the menu items found in the web user interface. But wait, there's more, because the MU2 can also be run as a Roon server or a Roon core. So we get to choose 2 terabytes or 8 terabytes of internal SSD at time of ordering. Now my Roon library is nearly 4 terabytes, so I went with the 8 terabyte drive. And now you might ask, does running the Roon core on the MU2 make it sound better? And the answer is no. I started with my library on a Nyquist 1 and found no audible advantage when moving that library from the SSD inside the Nyquist 1 to the SSD inside the Grimm. And copying the entire library across the network took the best part of a weekend. It was a royal pain in the ass. That said, the MU2 is more responsive than the Nyquist 1 when accessing the Roon library as a private streaming service using Roon Arc, because playback starts more snappily on the MU2 than the Nyquist 1 and its internal SSD. I don't know why this is, it just is. But yeah, with the MU2 being so Roon focused, I would say you need to factor in the €850 for a lifetime's worth of Roon. Now Eelco Grimm says he has plans to add UPnP support to the MU2's tiny core Linux OS, but it's not with us just yet. And you'll need to set the MU2 as your Roon core if you want it to display artist and song info on its front panel display. But at 3.5 inches across, This screen, I think, is too small to be read from the listening position, or if you do, you really have to squint. And after a few months of squinting at it, I just turned it off. Now, many of you still ask in the comments how I put Roon's now playing information and cover art on my TV. Now, there are two ways to do this. We can either have Roon send its now playing info to a Google Chromecast TV, which is hooked into the back of the TV with HDMI, or we can use a third-party Apple TV app called TV Remote. Now, TV Remote allows us to change Roon zones and select music, albeit with kind of basic browsing functionality, but that tvOS app lets us customize the now playing screen. So I tend to get rid of the artist and song info to leave just the cover art. And I would like to thank Roon for sponsoring this video. So to add streaming service functionality other than Roon to the MU2, I usually connect a WiiM Ultra to the coaxial socket on the back. But sometimes I'll add a CD player, again with coaxial, because my Samsung TV always occupies the Toslink socket. Although I have used the Shanling ET3 and the DCS network bridge over AES EBU. However, one of my favorite features of the MU2 is its analog preamplifier. And this is not a passive preamplifier. Elko Grimm told me via email that the volume control is part of the buffer stage and that it addresses phase modulation issues in solid state that not many people are aware of. I'm paraphrasing there. He probably didn't say exactly that, but that was the vibe of what he was saying. Now, perhaps this is why I never, not once, felt like putting a standard preamplifier between the MU2 and a power amp, as I always do with the WiiM Ultra. And that's because the WiiM sounds comparatively thin and reedy as a preamp, and we wouldn't reasonably expect anything more from its €400 asking price. By contrast, the Grimm sounds sufficiently meaty on its own. It demands zero outboard intervention, and that's as true of analog sources as it is with digital sources. So right now I have a Torrens TD124 and PS Audio Stellaphono stage connected to the back of the Grimm to its XLR balanced inputs. And I have a Rotel Mishi Q5 CD player connected to its single-ended RCA sockets. And yes, before you ask, the MU2's DAC has more jump factor than the Rotel's internal DAC, which in turn heavily shades the WiiM Ultra's DAC. And I would say, once again, with these three units listened to as standalone DACs, we get what we pay for. So not only is the Grimm MU2 the most expensive DAC I've heard to date, it is also the best sounding DAC that I've heard to date, albeit by the slimmest of margins, because comparing DACs is all about slim margins. But the MU2 is also a Roon streamer, a Roon server, and an analog preamplifier. And I think it has the best volume control wheel this side of Name's Unity series. So right now I have the MU2 firing into a Mola Perca power amplifier for a 2-box solution that's more compact than the Mishi Q5 CD player sitting next to it, which is a bit ridiculous really, isn't it? Anyway, that's all from me for today. Like and subscribe according to your preferences, and hit us up on Patreon if you want 4 years of music playlists. Basically, I make music playlists for every video. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Whew, that was a lot, wasn't it? And I have to apologize if I didn't talk about what you wanted to hear about, because one man, that's me, can only do so much. But let's wrap this video with a quick album recommendation. This is Craig Finn's new one. It's called Always Been. I don't think I've heard Finn's storyteller songs sound so musically expansive as this, And that's probably because Always Been was produced by the War on Drugs' Adam Granduciel, I don't know how you say that. Anyway, go take a listen.